KaraokeBooks.
Dubrovsky. Aleksandr Pushkin. Translated by Keane. Audiobook. Chapter 12. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the guests who had passed the night at Pokrovsko repaired one after the other to the sitting room, where the tea urn was already boiling, and before which sat Maria Kirillovna in a morning gown, and Kirilla Petrovich in a frieze coat and slippers, drinking his tea out of a large cup like a wash-hand basin. The last to appear was Anton Pafanautic. He was so pale, and seemed so troubled, that everybody was struck by his appearance, and Kirilla Petrovich inquired after his health. Spitzin replied in an evasive manner, glaring with horror at the tutor, who sat there as if nothing had happened. A few minutes afterwards a servant entered and announced to Spitzin that his carriage was ready. Anton Pafanautic hastened to take his leave of the company, and then hurried out of the room and started off immediately. The guests and the host could not understand what had happened to him, and Kirilla Petrovich came to the conclusion that he was suffering from an attack of indigestion. After tea and the farewell breakfast, the other guests began to take their leave, and soon Pokrovsko became empty, and everything went on in the usual manner. Several days passed, and nothing remarkable had happened. The life of the inhabitants of Pokrovsko became very monotonous. Kirilla Petrovich went out hunting every day, while Maria Kirillovna devoted her time to reading, walking, and especially to musical exercises. She was beginning to understand her own heart, and acknowledged to herself with involuntary vexation that she was not indifferent to the good qualities of the young Frenchman. He, on his side, never overstepped the limits of respect and strict decorum, and thereby quieted her pride and her timid suspicions. With more and more confidence she gave herself up to the alluring habit of seeing him. She felt dull without Deforge, and in his presence she was constantly occupied with him, wishing to know his opinion of everything, and always agreeing with him. She was not yet in love with him perhaps, but at the first accidental obstacle or unexpected reverse of destiny, the flame of passion would burst forth within her heart. One day, on entering the parlor, where the tutor awaited her, Maria Kirillovna observed with astonishment that he looked pale and troubled. She opened the piano and sang a few notes, but Dubrovsky, under the pretext of a headache, apologized, interrupted the lesson, closed the music, and slipped a note into her hand. Maria Kirillovna, without pausing to reflect, took it, and repented almost at the same moment for having done so. But Dubrovsky was no longer in the room. Maria Kirillovna went to her room, unfolded the note, and read as follows. "Be in the arbor near the brook this evening, at 7 o'clock. It is necessary that I should speak to you." Her curiosity was strongly excited. She had long expected a declaration, desiring it and dreading it at one and the same time. It would have been agreeable to her to hear the confirmation of what she divined, but she felt that it would have been unbecoming to hear such a declaration from a man who, on account of his position, ought never to aspire to win her hand. She resolved to go to the meeting place, but she hesitated about one thing: in what manner she ought to receive the tutor's declaration, with aristocratic indignation, with friendly admonition, with good-humored banter, or with silent sympathy. In the meantime she kept constantly looking at the clock. It grew dark. Candles were brought in. Kirilla Petrovich sat down to play at Boston, with some of his neighbors who had come to pay him a visit. The clock struck 7:15, and Maria Kirillovna walked quietly out onto the steps, looked round on every side, and then hastened into the garden. The night was dark, the sky was covered with clouds, and it was impossible to see anything at a distance of 2 paces. But Maria Kirillovna went forward in the darkness along paths that were quite familiar to her, and in a few minutes she reached the arbor. There she paused in order to draw breath and to present herself before Deforge with an air of calm indifference. But Deforge already stood before her. I thank you, he said in a low, sad voice, for having granted my request. I should have been in despair if you had not complied with it. Maria Kirillovna answered him in the words she had prepared beforehand. I hope you will not cause me to repent of my condescension. He was silent, and seemed to be collecting himself. Circumstances demand. I am obliged to leave you, he said at last. It may be that you will soon hear, but before going away, I must have an explanation with you. Maria Kirillovna made no reply. In these words she saw the preface to the expected declaration. I am not what you suppose, continued he, lowering his head. I am not the Frenchman Deforge, I am Dubrovsky. Maria Kirillovna uttered a cry. Do not be alarmed, for God's sake. You need not be afraid of my name. Yes, I am that unhappy person, whom your father, after depriving him of his last crust of bread, drove out of his paternal home and sent on to the highway to rob. But you need not be afraid, either on your own account or on his. All is over. I have forgiven him, you have saved him. My first crime of blood was to have been accomplished upon him. I prowled round his house, determining where the fire should burst out, where I should enter his bedroom, and how I should cut him off from all means of escape. At that moment you passed by me like a heavenly vision, and my heart was subdued. I understood that the house in which you dwelt was sacred, that not a single person, connected with you by the ties of blood, could lie beneath my curse. I looked upon vengeance as madness, and dismissed the thought of it from my mind. Whole days I wandered around the gardens of Pokrovskoe, in the hope of seeing your white robe in the distance. In your incautious walks I followed you, stealing from bush to bush, happy in the thought that for you there was no danger, where I was secretly present. At last an opportunity presented itself. I established myself in your house. Those 3 weeks were for me days of happiness. The recollection of them will be the joy of my sad life. Today I received news which renders it impossible for me to remain here any longer. I part from you today at this very moment. But before doing so, I felt that it was necessary that I should reveal myself to you, so that you might not curse me nor despise me. Think sometimes of Dubrovsky. Know that he was born for another fate, that his soul was capable of loving you, that never. Just then a loud whistle resounded, and Dubrovsky became silent. He seized her hand and pressed it to his burning lips. The whistle was repeated. Farewell, said Dubrovsky, they are calling me. A moment's delay may destroy me. He moved away. Maria Kirillovna stood motionless. Dubrovsky returned and once more took her by the hand. If misfortune should ever overtake you, and you are unable to obtain help or protection from anybody, will you promise to apply to me, to demand from me everything that may be necessary for your happiness? Will you promise not to reject my devotion? Maria Kirillovna wept silently. The whistle resounded for the 3rd time. You will destroy me, cried Dubrovsky, but I will not leave you until you give me a reply. Do you promise me or not? I promise, murmured the poor girl. Greatly agitated by her interview with Dubrovsky, Maria Kirillovna returned from the garden. As she approached the house, she perceived a great crowd of people in the courtyard. A troika was standing in front of the steps. The servants were running hither and thither, and the whole house was in a commotion. In the distance she heard the voice of Kirilla Petrovich, and she hastened to reach her room, fearing that her absence might be noticed. Kirilla Petrovich met her in the hall. The visitors were pressing round our old acquaintance the sheriff, and were overwhelming him with questions. The sheriff, in traveling dress, and armed from head to foot, answered them with a mysterious and anxious air. "Where have you been, Masha?" asked Kirilla Petrovich. "Have you seen Monsieur Deforge?" Masha could scarcely answer in the negative. Just imagine, continued Kirilla Petrovich. The sheriff has come to arrest him, and assures me that he is Dubrovsky. He answers the description in every respect, Your Excellency, said the sheriff respectfully. Oh. Brother, interrupted Kirilla Petrovich, go to. You know where, with your descriptions. I will not surrender my Frenchman to you until I have investigated the matter myself. How can anyone believe the word of Anton Pathanautich, a coward and a clown? He must have dreamt that the tutor wanted to rob him. Why didn't he tell me about it the next morning? He never said a word about the matter. The Frenchman threatened him, Your Excellency, replied the sheriff, and made him swear that he would preserve silence. A pack of lies, exclaimed Kirilla Petrovich. I will have this mystery cleared up immediately. Where is the tutor? He asked of a servant who entered at that moment. He cannot be found anywhere, replied the servant. Then search for him, cried Trokorov, beginning to entertain doubts. Show me your vaunted description, said he to the sheriff, who immediately handed him the paper. 23 years old, etc., etc. That is so, but yet that does not prove anything. Well, what about the tutor? He is not to be found, was again the answer. Kirilla Petrovich began to be uneasy. Maria Kirillovna was neither dead nor alive. You are pale, Masha, remarked her father to her. Have they frightened you? No, Papa, replied Masha. I have a headache. Go to your own room, Masha, and don't be alarmed. Masha kissed his hand and retired hastily to her room. There she threw herself upon her bed and burst into a hysterical flood of tears. The maids hastened to her assistance, undressed her with difficulty, and with difficulty succeeded in calming her by means of cold water and all possible kinds of smelling salts. They put her to bed and she fell into a slumber. In the meantime the Frenchman could not be found. Kirilla Petrovich paced up and down the room, loudly whistling his favorite military air. The visitors whispered among themselves. The sheriff looked foolish. The Frenchman was not to be found. Probably he had managed to escape through being warned beforehand. But by whom and how? That remained a mystery. It was 11 o'clock, but nobody thought of sleep. At last Kirilla Petrovich said angrily to the sheriff, Well, do you wish to stop here till daylight? My house is not an inn. It is not by any cleverness on your part, brother, that Dubrovsky will be taken, if he really be Dubrovsky. Return home, and in future be a little quicker. And it is time for you to go home, too, he continued, addressing his guests. Order the horses to be got ready. I want to go to bed. In this ungracious manner did Trokorov take leave of his guests.
If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the channel.